Welcome to the Sport Life YouTube channel. My name is Kevin Ward. Let's get right into today's video. So today we're going to be covering the NFC West division, going into the 2026 offseason. I think a lot of people would say that this was the best division in football, from this past year. You had three teams that were vying for the NFC number one seed. And, came down to two of those teams in the NFC Championship game. Ultimately, with Seattle being the best team in the NFL, proving it in the toughest division, and proving it in the Super Bowl. So give my credit off to them. They earned it. Absolutely incredible defense. Had a great run game ran by Clint Kubiak, and got to give Sam Darnold his credit. Definitely delivered when it mattered most and was absolutely incredible in the NFC Championship. So let's start off with them in this division. So Seattle, Super Bowl champions last year, Sam Darnold. It's crazy to think that out of his draft class that involves Josh and Lamar and Baker Mayfield and Josh Rosen, he's the one with the ring. But he is. And, he's not a perfect player, but he absolutely delivered in every way that they needed him to. And, he's a very talented quarterback, whether we like to admit it or not. Great arm talent. And, again, he delivered when it mattered most. Going into the offseason, didn't really add a whole lot. Didn't really improve the team as much going forward. I'd say their biggest offseason acquisition was probably Jadarian Price, running back that they took in the first round, out of Notre Dame, who was the main backup behind Jeremiah Love. I would say that's probably a reach. I didn't really love this running back class coming out. Obviously, it's hard not to love Jeremiah Love, who's kind of on that Bijan, Gibbs level of prospect, Gene T, and Jadarian looks like a really good player. I just don't know if I would have spent a first-round pick on him. And, I understand there's an obvious need with Kenneth Walker leaving, but, we'll see how it turns out. Maybe he ends up being a much more productive NFL player than I think. But, when you really look at everybody that they added, right, they didn't really add a whole lot that, screams as like difference makers for me going forward. But they sure lost a lot. Kenneth Walker, Super Bowl MVP, was definitely the main driving force for them going forward. You lose them to Kansas City. Zach Charbonnet, tears his knee up, deep in the playoff run. And so, obvious need to go get Jadarian Price and sign Emmanuel Wilson. But we'll see how this running game looks. That was kind of what this whole offense was built off of. It's really helped, Sam Darnold, create some explosives with Jackson Smith and Jigba off that play action game. And we'll see if Jadarian Price and Emmanuel Wilson can have that same impact going forward and help Sam create a lot of those explosive down the field shots. You might have to ask more of Sam this year to run and direct this offense going forward. But, we'll see how it impacts much. Kenneth Walker is absolutely explosive. Losing him, and I understand not wanting to pay running backs a whole lot of money unless they're absolutely true game changers, which I don't know if Kenneth Walker really is. He's an absolutely great running back, but I don't know if I'd put him on that, Saquon, Bijan, Gibbs, CMC level of running back. So I understand not wanting to put your money towards him, but you are still going to feel him missing on that side of the ball. Another guy that they lost, Tariq Woolen, who's their cornerback too, right aside from Devon Witherspoon. And again, lost him to the Eagles. They paid him a lot of money on a one-year deal. I feel like you're going to feel missing him a lot. Again, you would see him get a lot of stupid penalties, in the game, but he definitely brought an attitude and a physicality to that defense and helped make one of the most complete, back-end secondaries in the NFL last year. And so for him, this is a big opportunity for him to go to the Eagles. Again, another loaded secondary and to be a part of a great defense potentially over there. But, again, losing a guy like that, from Seattle, you're definitely going to feel it. And, they didn't add a whole lot to fill that hole. I think they're just hoping that the way they develop players and the way they draft is going to help fill it naturally. And who am I to say that they won't, right? I think John Schneider's one of the absolute elite GMs in the game and constantly puts his team in successful positions to win and be competitive going forward. So, we'll see how it turns out. There's no one on this roster that immediately catches my eye to fill that Riq Woolen spot, but we'll see how the season develops, and maybe we'll see something by surprise. Another guy that they lost that was a big contributor on that defensive line, Boye Mafe, ends up going to the Cincinnati Bengals. Again, physical, tough guy, brought a lot of pressure on the quarterback and really helped complete that D-line going forward. And again, you didn't really fill his spot either. Again, maybe you're just hoping on your development and, what they have going, amongst their younger players. But the way I see it, you lost a lot of pieces. You didn't really gain a whole lot of pieces to fill those holes, going forward. So another guy that they lost, in that great secondary of theirs was Kobe Durant. He goes somewhere else, and you're definitely going to feel his missing presence. I know that they signed someone to kind of fill that void in Rodney Thomas, but I'm not sure if he's the same caliber player as Kobe Durant that helped make that secondary as strong as it was, and really felt like, their version of Legion of Boom 2.0. So, again, another guy that you lost that made significant impact on that team, on that defense of what made it so great. He filled it with Rodney Thomas. Hopefully he can fill that void in that production, but I'm not so sure going forward. So again, just talking about, what they added, what they subtracted. Don't know if they really, filled all the holes they really needed to fill. It doesn't feel that way. Not sure if Ja'Jarian Price is going to be as good as Kenneth Walker in this offense. We'll see. Felt like he was kind of a reach in the first round. Felt like he could have gotten him in the second, third round, stuff like that. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the league saw him a lot higher, than I see him. But it felt like you were just kind of grabbing for need instead of best player available in that spot. And we'll see how it goes going forward. But got some question marks about Seattle. I still think this is, an absolutely great defense. You got Nicky Minori, you got Devon Witherspoon, you got Jackson Smith and Jigba. You got some absolute monsters on this team. So I still think this is going to be a high-end playoff team. Don't know if they're going to win the division again. Don't know if that defense will have the absolute same impact it had last year. For me, I have them sitting between 10 wins and 12 wins going into this year. A lot's going to be put more on Sam Darnold's shoulders. And for me, I think they're going to place about third in the division, but it wouldn't surprise me if they finish first or second. Again, very tough division, very, very, very talented, with three teams that I think will still be vying to be the NFC 1 seed. I think a contributor that they need a lot going forward, especially offensively, Cooper Kupp's aging. He's getting older. He was very nice to have on that playoff run. He was just consistent and a quality player. But I think an explosive player that they're really going to want to see, grow going forward is Torrey Horton out of Colorado State. He's going into his second year. He was a dynamic special teams player for them, and you saw a lot of explosive plays out of him. And I think he needs to be that nice complement to JSN going forward. And I think they're hoping so as well. I didn't see a lot of wide receiver offseason additions, to this group, and I think they see a lot of promise in Torrey Horton. I think he would have went higher in the draft if he didn't have those injuries in college. So I think, Seattle's pretty happy with where they got him, and I think they're going to lean a little bit more on him going forward, into this 2026 season. So that's kind of my coverage on Seattle going into 2026, how their offseason looked. They're still going to be a great team. I think they have one of the best front offices in the league. John Schneider's an absolute elite GM. Their head coach, Mike McDonald, has devised one of the most complex and just absolutely dominant defenses. And I still think they're going to be dominant. I don't know if they're going to be as dominant as they were last year because, like I said, lost a lot. I don't know if they added a whole lot. But it wouldn't surprise me if, Mike McDonald's got a few gems that they've been developing. And, again, still think he's one of the elite head coaches in the NFL. So Seattle's still going to be a very, very tough team in this division. But as I've seen from their offseason and everything going forward, I picked them to finish third in this division between 10 and 12 wins. All right, let's dive into the next team that finished second in this division, the Los Angeles Rams. And I think a lot of people are picking them to go to the Super Bowl and be the NFC representative going forward. They had their battles with Seattle and San Francisco, and they lost in a great NFC championship game to Seattle this past year. Seattle proved they were the better team. Matt Stafford played at an MVP level, and Puka Nacua was absolutely incredible, and Devontae Adams looked like he just fit so naturally in this offense with Sean McVay and Matt Stafford. But, going forward, right, they got something to prove this year. Don't think it sat very well that they didn't get to the Super Bowl last year and finish second in the division, especially on a team that, had Matt Stafford win the MVP. You're probably feeling like we should have been the NFC representative, right? And they definitely are putting their chips on the table with some of the moves they made this past year, right? Talking about subtractions and additions that they made to their group, right? I mean, that was a huge trade to get Trent McDuffie, to help, a struggling secondary that really got exposed, especially by Jackson Smith and Jigba. What better way to go try and battle that by go getting one of the elite corners in the game, and Trent McDuffie, who was huge for, some of those Super Bowl runs for the Kansas City Chiefs. And, they paid him a hefty contract. He's in the prime of his career. They're going for it with that move. And they're trying to tell you, hey, like we saw what we needed to do to address some of our issues. And this is kind of our main solution to that. Another guy that they added, again, from Kansas City. Kansas City had a great secondary during their Super Bowl runs. Jalen Watson, he comes over and, again, just helps bolster probably the weakest part of that defense and that they're going to need. And he's going to provide a lot of veteran experience, and he's going to provide a lot more talent to a group that just really wasn't that talented, last year, and it did get exposed, by Sam Darnold and JSN in the NFC Championship. So give Les Snead and give Sean McVay a lot of credit for addressing a lot of those needs going forward. Their defensive line, they're going to need to be the core strength of this team going forward. Their linebackers are, for the most part, they're pretty solid. But it was definitely the cornerback room that needed, the biggest improvement, the biggest push to really kind of put this team over the edge. Offensively, this team is still elite. Puka, Devontae, Stafford, Kyron Williams, Blake Corum, their assortment of tight ends. Terrence Ferguson. They drafted Max Clare out of Ohio State, in the second round. So they just keep adding talent to that room. So they're offensively, they're still going to be fine. I think the natural question that you hold in your mind, right? Can Stafford stay healthy at his old age? Can Devontae Adams stay healthy at his old age? And, can those guys be healthy when it really matters in the playoffs? Because if you say yes, I think you like your chances going to the Super Bowl this year. And you like how well-rounded this team is. And Sean's absolutely elite as a head coach. In my opinion, he's top 3 head coach in the NFL. Been to 2 Super Bowls, won 1. And I think this group feels as talented as any team he's really had. I'd say on the defensive side of the ball, Von Miller and Aaron Donald and all those guys, Jalen Ramsey, probably a more talented defense, but I think you still like your chances with the defense you have. Me personally, I have them finishing first in the division this year. I think they're going to be somewhere between 11 and 13 wins, maybe get to that 14-win mark. Again, I think it's tough for all these teams in this division to get to 14, 13 wins just because they got to play each other and they got to battle it out. And so that makes it hard for you to get there. They all kind of found a way to get there last year, which was more than impressive. But we'll see how it shapes out this year. With the Rams, they're feeling like we got to get it done sooner or later. Funny I say that when they make the 13th pick in the draft, Ty Simpson, which you could have went a number of different ways, right? You could have went Ruben Bain. You could have went tight end Kenyon Sadiq. You could have went Mekhi Lemon. You could have went a bunch of different ways to contribute to this year. But in their mind, they felt we're never going to be this high in the draft, so let's go get a quarterback and plan for the future. That could go a bunch of different ways, right? I mean, I think what you've seen historically, it does work out well for the young quarterback developing behind a great veteran and a great offensive-minded head coach. Jordan Love, Aaron Rodgers, and Matt LaFleur, Patrick Mahomes, Alex Smith, Andy Reid, Aaron Rodgers with Brett Favre and Mike McCarthy and those guys. It typically goes well going forward for that guy, sitting behind, a Hall of Fame vet or a very good vet, and Alex Smith, a great offensive mind. to kind of sit and learn the NFL life and the NFL game, and really learn from watching someone do it and really learn, from the head coach before just being thrust in. So typically history favors that player very well. In terms of teams, a lot of those teams didn't really win when that happened, right? Like they didn't win the Super Bowl. Aaron Rodgers, they lost to Tom Brady and the Buccaneers. And again, that first round pick wasn't as high as pick 13, but you definitely could have used that pick on someone to really help contribute to this team, in some way or form. And I think Rodgers, you could have gotten an impactful wide receiver in that draft. You could have, just gotten something more immediately impactful in that draft to really help that Packers Super Bowl run. And I think Packers fans are always wondering, what if, right? What if we didn't take Jordan Love? What if we got someone else who could have helped put us over the hump? And, I'm sure that haunts him, right? Kansas City wasn't as immediate a Super Bowl contender, with Alex Smith and Andy Reid. So you understand they wanted to go get someone that eventually would put him over the hump, which he did. And so you get that part, kind of same thing with the Brett Favre thing with the Aaron Rodgers situation, right? Like, could have helped, push them over the hump for another Super Bowl in Brett Favre's career, and they decided to opt for the future. And, again, Packers fans might wonder, what if we made a different pick there? Would that have made a difference? So we'll see how, time will tell with the Los Angeles Rams. Again, Matt Stafford goes and wins the Super Bowl. You're not really thinking about it too much, and then you're like, all right, we got our guy, going into the future. But definitely a situation to watch going forward. Ty Simpson, for the most part, I don't know if this guy would have been the high-end first-round quarterback, in a different class, like let's say the 2027 class with Arch Manning and Dante Moore and all those guys. Like, are we sure he would have went in the first round? I'm not so sure. And, I think that, the quality of quarterback play in this class that came up, I think just helped Ty Simpson's case to be drafted higher, more of the lack of talent than him being that good. So I got some question marks about that pick going forward. Again, Stafford wins the Super Bowl, he takes over and he ends up being a quality player. Doesn't matter. They look like geniuses. But, we'll see how that situation develops going forward. If the Rams just missed going to another Super Bowl this year, you're definitely going to think about, what the 13th pick could have been, especially if Mekhi Lemon's really good or Ruben Baines is stud on the edge or Kenyon Sadiq, it turns out to be this freak tight end that guys are hoping him to be. So again, I still have the Rams finishing first in this division. They addressed a major need in their secondary. They bring all their offensive pieces back from a great offense last year that led to an MVP season for Stafford. So they're going to be a fun, exciting team to watch, and they're going to be an absolute dominant team going forward in the NFC, and the team we're expecting to come out of the NFC going to the Super Bowl. All right, going to the team that finished third in this division, the San Francisco 49ers. Absolutely decimated with injuries last year. You got to tip your cap to Kyle Shanahan and this Niners team. They lost Fred, they lost Nick Bosa, they lost George in the NFC playoffs, and they still found a way to win 12-plus games and had a chance to win the division, going into the last week before, Seattle took that game from them. I think naturally you would say you're getting all those pieces back if you're healthy, which is a huge question mark for the Niners. It is every year because, we seem to be going through these kind of seasons once every other year. We'll see how it goes, but they definitely get all those pieces back. I think naturally you'd say they'd be right back in the same position, and they made a lot of big offseason acquisitions. Hard to not start off with the future Hall of Fame wide receiver Mike Evans. He had that incredible 1,000-yard season streak. Finally snapped. He tied with Jerry Rice. That is nothing to sneeze at. And he's going to provide that Niners offense with something they haven't had. That true X, one-on-one beater, red zone threat, in Mike Evans. And, Kyle's never really had a player like him in this, 49er era. He obviously had something like him in Julio Jones to an even more talented degree. But in this San Francisco era, Debo, Juwan, Brandon Ayuk, none of those guys were able to pull off the stuff that Mike Evans has been able to pull off. So he's going to provide a lot for this offense, and he's a true number one. Is he as elite as he was when he was younger? No, absolutely not. And he is into his 30s, so it does bring some questions with his health. Can he maintain it going forward? I think another thing you got to also look at from a positivity standpoint, look at some of the guys, kind of built like him, into their 30s. Andre Johnson, Anquan Bolden, Larry Fitzgerald. And they all seem to have some very productive years into those 30s. And the Niners are kind of hoping that from Mike going forward. Up until last year, he hasn't had a lot of major injury concerns. So we'll see how it goes going forward. But I think he's going to provide a true number one that they didn't have. And I'm sure Brock's super stoked to have him going forward as a guy that he can throw it up and win, in contested situations, third down situations. And he's going to provide a much added dynamic that they haven't had. Another offseason addition, this time to their defense, Osa Odigizua. Niners traded a third-round pick for him. And, again, he's not going to stuff the stat sheet by any means, but you're going to feel him on the defensive side of the ball, right? He's going to absorb a lot of double teams, create a lot of QB pressures that are going to help those edge rushers, kind of finish the job, right? And so his sack total may not be high, but you're going to see the quarterback feeling the interior pressure, from an inside standpoint that is going to create a lot of opportunities for your defense to make some plays. And he's going to stuff the run game a lot and really help open up those lanes for those linebackers a lot by him absorbing those double teams. So I think he adds a great piece that the Niners just didn't have last year. Obviously they're hoping that Alfred Collins and CJ West take a step forward, but you get a guy in his prime, Osa Odigizua, in his prime that's really going to make a difference going forward. Another offseason acquisition is a fan favorite, Dre Greenlaw, linebacker that the Broncos let go. Have definitely had an injury-riddled season last year. And, the Niners needed him back. They had a revolving door linebacker last year. They had tons of injuries, obviously, to Fred and all sorts of guys, and they just needed a more stabilizing force from a talent perspective as well. I would say that you would say this linebacking core definitely had struggles last year. They did as much as they could, and going to that playoff game, you had two guys that weren't even on your opening day roster. I think that says a lot. So, all things considered, if you get a healthy Dre Greenlaw for the Niners going forward, he's definitely going to make his presence felt, and you're definitely going to see a difference in this defensive group if you're able to get a healthy guy like him back. From coverage to him making an impact in the run game, his attitude, his physicality, all those things. They're definitely gonna love having him back, and I'm sure there's no one more excited to have him back than Fred Warner. That's his partner in crime, right? And you saw Fred was just absolutely devastated in the Super Bowl when he tore his Achilles. And going forward, we'll see if he can be the same guy again. Again, still riddled with injuries last year. So, number one thing again with this team is health. Like, can they be healthy? And that's a big question mark going forward. Just naturally with this team, you got Fred coming off a major injury, Nick coming off another major knee injury. That's a big question mark for him going forward. Mike Evans coming off injury, older guy. So a lot of this hinges on health. I think if they're healthy, the talent's still there for them to be a really good competitive team. They added another guy named Christian Kirk, a veteran wide receiver that Brock will sure love to have, been in the NFL for a long time. I think he's a Kyle Shanahan kind of guy. He's going to make some tough catches in the slot, and, he can win on the outside occasionally, but he's going to provide another veteran presence for the Niners and this Kyle Shanahan offense that they're going to need, losing Juwan Jennings and Kendrick Bourne. So, some big offseason acquisitions for the Niners to really help a team that naturally you would hope if they're healthy. Again, I keep bringing it up, but you get all those guys back, Fred, Nick, all the George, at some point you get all those guys back, and there's no reason this team shouldn't be a very talented, very tough team. I have them finishing second in the division. I have them somewhere between 10 and 12 wins, if all things go good going forward. They still got to play Seattle and the Rams twice a year. That's no tall task. A little side note, they got to travel the most out of any team in the NFL this year. That's going to show, and that's going to wear and tear on you. There's just no way around that. But you're going to have to just battle through it. And, if this is the team that they're hoping they're going to be, you can't make excuses. You just got to, go grind through the season. You got to find a way to make it work. And we'll see how it does going forward. But like I said, I have them finishing second in the division behind the Rams and somewhere between 10 and 12 wins. We'll see how it does going forward. All right, let's talk about the Arizona Cardinals. Last year they finished fourth in the division. Feel bad for those guys. They had to go against three teams that at one point were vying for the NFC 1 seed. That's no tall task. You got to play those guys twice a year. They had a complete organizational change. They got rid of their head coach, Jonathan Gannon. They bring in Mike LaFleur, who's been an offensive OC candidate that has kind of had his name floated around for head coaching jobs for a while now. He gets his shot in, the toughest division in football. So, good luck to him. But they reset this whole thing. Kyler Murray, who's been their franchise quarterback for a long time, he's finally gone, right? They cut him, and now he's the quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings. So when you start off with just the head coach and the quarterback, that's a big shift. They're going to try and reset this thing and trying to find a way to be a competitive team in this division, and it's a tall task for them. They're maybe not as far away as people think, though. I actually like a lot of the pieces they have on this team. Michael Wilson was incredible for them last year. I always liked him coming out of Stanford. And he finally had his first 1,000-yard year with Jacoby Brissett at quarterback and was a great down-the-field threat for them. They drafted Jeremiah Love. I'm not a big fan of taking running backs that early, especially when you have probably some other needs you need to fit. But there's no doubt he is an ultra-talented running back who, is really going to help this run game in more ways than one. And, he's on that Bijan, Gibbs, G&T level of talent. That's why he got taken third in the draft. And he's going to help any offense, especially an offense that is going to be a Shanahan kind of style scheme, built off, this run game. And I think he's going to fit quite nicely into it. Now, we'll see if their offensive line can hold up. That's the other half of that battle, right? But I think no matter what, Jeremiah Love's going to provide a dynamic to this offense that they just haven't had. Connor's a very physical, tough running back. He can catch out of the backfield, but there's a level of explosiveness and home run ability that Love's going to be able to provide. So we'll see how that goes going forward, but he'll definitely be a guy to watch and see how much of an impact he can make. And another high-end draft pick for them, Marvin Harrison. You got to start seeing some of the production going forward. Otherwise, I think it's safe to say he's a bust. And he's had some productive years. But for the hype coming out of Ohio State, he was one of the most hyped wide receiver prospects ever. And, we're going to find out if it's more on Kyler or more on him. Kyler's gone, so let's see how you do with the next quarterback, whether it's Jacoby Brissett or Carson Beck. I know that's a lot to ask of him, but when you went as high as he did as the fourth pick in the draft, you're in year 3, the organization's hoping that you can be a true number 1 wide receiver. And you saw your counterpart with Jacoby Brissett get 1,000 yards. It's going to have fans thinking, right? Like, is he really that good? Is he going to be the guy we were hoping for when we drafted him? Is it a Kyler thing? What is it? But when you see your other guy get 1,000 yards with Jacoby Brissett, right, it naturally is going to raise that question. I'm a Marvin Harrison fan. I think with a healthy year this year and a reset, under a new offensive-minded head coach and, some better, more consistent quarterback play, I think Marvin is going to be good this year. And I think that will help Arizona, especially on the offensive side of the ball going forward, which, to be honest, they didn't have a terrible offense last year, all things considered. So definitely need those 3 core pieces. And then the other guy that's going to, add to this offense like he's done, especially the past 2 years, and you can argue he's been maybe the best tight end in the NFL, right? Trey McBride. Just had 1,000-yard season last year, was absolutely dominant. Doesn't matter who his quarterback is, he shows up every single Sunday. And he just creates mismatches consistently all over the field. And Mike's going to love having him, plug him into his offense. And, that's going to probably be his favorite weapon going forward, either him or Jeremiah Love. And so when you look at that Cardinals team and you look at their core offensive foundation, it's a lot to build off of. It's a lot of youth. It's a lot of talent. And they've shown that, they can be high-end productive players. Even Marvin Harrison, at times, he's shown he can be a high-end productive player. So, for Mike LaFleur, I think you got a lot to work with here. So now it's just naturally the big question. What are you going to do at quarterback? Jacoby Brissett's holding out for bigger money. I'm personally not a big fan of, trying to pay a guy that's not shown he can be a franchise quarterback. I get the leverage Jacoby's trying to bring to the table, but if I'm the Cardinals and I'm not looking to compete this year, I'm not sure I want to pay and allocate my money to a guy like that isn't going to get me into the playoffs. I think I'd just rather either A, go get a different vet for Carson Beck to learn behind, or just find out what you got in Carson Beck. Because next year, in what's supposed to be a loaded QB class, you need to find out what you got. And you need to find out, do we go get a quarterback next year? Do we have our guy in Carson Beck going forward, going into the future? Because it's not about winning this year. I think you just want to see some strides. You want to see some progress. And you need to find out what that decision is going to be at quarterback going forward. So again, with Arizona, didn't really add, a whole lot on the defensive side of the ball that, really makes you think they're going to make significant impacts going forward. I think you got some questions, with Budda Baker. Like, do you eventually trade him? Is he a part of that future? He's on the older end. He's still a really good safety in this league, but don't know if you want to continue paying him and have him be a part of your future going forward. I think you got to make some decisions, especially midseason when the trade deadline comes along. But, he's still a high-end productive player, so I still think you can get, some assets coming back that can help you going forward. So, yeah, it was some more additions that they added. They added Isaac Siamalo, offensive lineman that, should, again, help stabilize that offensive line going forward, that they really needed to, help that run game. I think this offense is going to be trying to be built off that run game and, some play action shots to all those talented pass catchers they have. So I think his presence is really going to help this team going forward. They lost a lot in terms of veteran defensive guys: Dalvin Tomlinson, Calais Campbell, Jalen Thompson. They lost a lot of guys, and they didn't really add a whole lot to fill those holes. So again, I think they're going to give a lot of opportunities to some young guys to develop going forward to, start building the core foundation of this defense. It's going to include a lot of growing pains. And again, you got to face, Kyle and Sean and, Sam Darnold in Seattle. I just think it's going to be another tough year for the Arizona Cardinals. I think they will put up some points, and offensively, I think they're going to be actually pretty solid with all the offensive talent they have around whoever the quarterback's going to be. If Mike LaFleur is, anything like his brother Matt, that offense should be pretty solid. But defensively, I think they're going to have a hard time stopping teams. And so Arizona's, again, they're going to have to build this thing from the ground up. Again, you still have some pretty good foundational pieces that you can build around, especially on the offensive side of the ball going forward. Got to figure out what you're going to do with Budda Baker. Again, my opinion, I think you got to get some assets and capital coming back, because they're not in contention to win. You still expect the Rams, the Niners, the Seattle Seahawks to be around for the next couple of years. And so you really got to, get some youth on this team. And I understand you need some sort of veteran leadership to lead these guys, but does Budda Baker really fit that timeline going forward? Is he more valuable for you to get stuff coming back than he is to teach some young guys, and you got to pay him a lot of money? So there's a lot of decisions for Arizona going forward as they restart this thing. But again, I don't think they're as far away as, people would naturally think with all that talent they have on the offensive side of the ball. So that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you like what you heard. We got some more stuff coming out, whether it's fantasy football, NFL stuff. We're going to be covering more divisions going forward. Again, thank you for staying tuned and listening to the video. Like and subscribe. This is the Sport Life YouTube channel.